My name is Erin. I've traveled many different roads in my life. I've been a law enforcement officer and first responder in the United States Coast Guard. I've worked in a couple of psychiatric hospitals, but now I'm a professional historian and podcaster. I've also had an interest in true crime for most of my life. In this podcast, I study some of the most notorious crimes through the lens of a historian and analyze what may have inspired criminals, investigators, and even society during the commission of those crimes and investigations. Join me as we look into the history behind the crime. Happy season finale. It's been, almost a year now since the podcast launched, and I have learned a lot about podcasting, and I know I have much more to learn, seeing that this is the second take of me recording this episode, because the first take just sounded like crap. And also I was recording in my closet and had a really weird echo, so I won't be doing that again. I've also met a lot of interesting people, and I've corresponded with a lot of them. Lovely people all around the world, which reminds me, welcome Brazil. That is awesome, Brazil. Anyhow, thank you for your support. Thank you for your feedback. Keep it coming, and I'll keep this intro short and simple today. This episode, I want to dive into a unique set of serial killers who hunt from interstates and highways. There are so many of them. In fact, if you Google interstate killer or highway killer, you will get dozens upon dozens of results. It's actually quite scary. It's especially scary for, people like me who travel a lot on interstates and highways when driving across the country. Fortunately, I normally have my dogs with me, and they're a great deterrent against people up to no good. But it's good to have your head on a swivel whenever you're on the interstate. As we go through this episode, please be aware that you are more likely to get into a car accident on a highway than you are to run afoul of a killer. Not that that should be any consolation prize. And I honestly hope I didn't jinx any of us by saying that. Overall, if you drive carefully, you're pretty safe on the interstates. Drive the speed limit, don't mess with your phone, use the left lane for passing only, stay a safe distance between you and other cars, use the left lane for passing only, don't drink and drive, don't pick up hitchhikers, use the left lane for passing only, and only stop in well-lit areas. Simple stuff like that. Oh, and don't listen to true crime podcasts when driving between Las Vegas and Reno. Just trust me on that one. When cars were first mass-produced in 1913, the United States didn't really have a road system set up for automobiles. Most roads were still dirt and built for wagons and horses rather than for cars. While today it may take you a week, depending on how much coffee you drink and how many times you stop, to drive coast to coast, back in 1913, it could take you a month or more to navigate both charted and uncharted roads while looking for places to stop for fuel. Think about it. 1913 is not even a whole generation removed from settlers heading out west in covered wagons. My own great-grandmother, my mom's grandmother, traveled to her new home in Oklahoma on a covered wagon, and that was after the turn of the century. Fortunately, in 1913, there were a slew of railroads to take you almost anywhere you wanted to go in the U.S., but people still loved the romanticism or just the sheer challenge of taking to the open roads. The U.S. military decided to test out the American road system in the summer of 1919, just shortly after the end of World War I. Soldiers and 81 Army vehicles geared up to drive cross-country from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco. It was an exercise to see how long it would take to mobilize a military force cross-country without the assistance of trains and even airplanes, which were still in their infancy. Following the Lincoln Highway, today known as US 30, the convoy averaged 6 miles per hour and approximately 58 miles a day, which is just barely above walking speed. The convoy arrived in San Francisco after 62 days. 2 months! Observing this trip was a young Army Lieutenant Colonel Dwight D. Eisenhower, and the experience, well, let's just say it had a lasting effect on him. Bureau of Public Roads Chief Thomas M. McDonald understood the need for long-distance highways, especially for national defense. But he didn't necessarily believe the federal government should pay for it. A lot of people back then didn't think the federal government should pay for a lot of anything, and most people thought it was just a state issue. The Federal Highway Act of 1921 strengthened state highway departments and gave them more control over the highways in their own state. Soon, the country would see more paved roads built specifically for automobiles that connected towns and cities to each other. A lot of roads in less populated areas were still dirt tracks, but they were much improved over wagon ruts in the ground. By the 1930s, more people owned automobiles. The road system needed an upgrade, and people needed jobs because of the Great Depression. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who is one of my favorites despite probably some of the more darker moments during his presidency, sent a proposal to Congress suggesting that the federal government build 43,000 miles of highway rather than imposing a toll system on American drivers. A lot of people in Congress liked the idea, while others called it a, quote, socialist scheme. Guess they used the same scare techniques then as they do now. But there was still a wild card out there. A man who knew firsthand the benefits of a national road system and who would become Captain America in the flesh. Well, more like General America. Or I guess, rather, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces, General Eisenhower. Not only had Eisenhower witnessed the snail-pace Army convoy in 1919, but he had witnessed the ingenuity of the Reichsautobahn, or today more appropriately known as the German Autobahn. By the time World War II began, the Germans had already constructed over 2,400 miles of 2- and 4-lane highways across both Germany and Austria that even went over or through mountains. Eisenhower was very impressed, especially since the Autobahn made it easier to move Allied forces across Germany and take down the Third Reich. But anyway, Eisenhower was elected president in 1952, and after the Korean War, he started to tackle the issue of America's highway system. No one could ever accuse Eisenhower of being a dirty socialist, so he had an easier time introducing his interstate system idea, and in 1954, Congress passed the Federal Aid Highway Act, which authorized $175 million for an interstate system. But this really wasn't what Eisenhower wanted. He wanted Congress to fund 90% of the project, but there were still some in Congress that just really didn't see the point. Eisenhower took another swing at it in 1956, and his administration recommended taxing gas to fund construction of the interstate system. I mean, it's gotta have to be paid for somehow. Eisenhower signed the Federal Aid Highway Act in 1956, which permitted the federal government to pay for 90% of the construction. Those dang socialists. The initial estimated cost was $25 billion over the course of 12 years, but ended up costing roughly $114 billion over the course of 35 years, which is just over $500 billion in today's money. And the interstate system is now made up of over 46,870 miles of road. Most of us know that the interstate changed pretty much everything. Unfortunately, towns the interstate bypass died or lost a vast majority of its population. Suburbanization boomed because the interstate made it easy to travel from your house in the burbs to your office in the city. Tourism increased, as did the demand for gas stations, rest stops, hotels, and restaurants. The world's largest ball of twine, largest rocking chair, largest ketchup bottle, and other tourist traps increased. More people began traveling to places like Arizona and Florida and staying there. And a vast majority of America's goods shipped over land via semi-trucks rather than rail. But we'll talk about that later. The interstate system changed American culture and crime. In preparation for this episode, I read Ginger Strand's book, Killer of the Road. In the book, she wrote a lot about car culture in the 1950s and correlated the birth of America's highways with the increase of violence in the second half of the 20th century. Indeed, there may be something there. I wouldn't fully contribute the increase in crime to the construction of the interstate system, but I do believe it was a contributing factor. Most of the studies I found focused mainly on the increase of burglary and car thefts along major roadways, but it's not necessarily jumping the shark to assume interstates and highways made it easier for violent offenders to commit their crimes as well. The interstate system made it easier to hunt for high-risk victims, such as hitchhikers, drifters, and truck stop sex workers, and it offered easy getaways and anonymity. Quite simply, America became more mobile and more violent at the same time. In her book, Strand begins with the brutal crimes that inspired the movies Badlands and Natural Born Killers. Both movies I highly recommend. Crimes committed by Charles Starkweather and Carol Ann Fugate in the winter of 1957 and 58. When I think of the late 1950s, I normally picture Leave It to Beaver and Norman Rockwell scenes of a happy nuclear family. Children grew up obedient and respectful and were home promptly by curfew. I also remembered this was the time of rebel without a cause and hot rod culture like in American Graffiti. More and more teenagers owned or had access to cars, and some of these teenagers started to rebel against their parents and society. That's what Charles Starkweather did in 1957, in a big way. Starkweather grew up in a relatively poor family in Lincoln, Nebraska, and desired to be rich. It probably really didn't help him out too much that he was nearsighted, spoke with a speech impediment, and was bow-legged. He was also a bully and a high school dropout. He worked menial jobs and went in with a friend to buy a used car. This friend also introduced 18-year-old Starkweather to 13-year-old Carol Ann Fugate, and the two hit it off and claimed to be in love. Starkweather spoiled Fugate and bought her gifts because the Fugate family were poorer than the Starkweathers and lived in a measly shack in the bad section of town. But the Bartletts, Fugate's parents, didn't approve of Starkweather, not necessarily because of his age, but because he was a bad seed. In late November 1957, Starkweather tried to buy a stuffed animal at a gas station on credit, but the attendant, Robert Culvert, wouldn't allow it. So Starkweather wanted revenge. The next night, on November 30th, Starkweather went into the store on 2 separate occasions and bought Penny Annie's stuff, and then returned with a shotgun and wearing a bandana over his face. Of course, he was still wearing the same clothes. He wasn't too bright. Starkweather forced Culvert to open the safe and then took Culvert and his car to a remote area and shot and killed the attendant. Authorities wouldn't link Starkweather to Culvert's murder until after his reign of terror ended. By late January, Starkweather had lost his job and was evicted from where he was living because he couldn't afford the rent. This triggered him, so he went to the Bartlett home with a rifle. Later, Starkweather and Fugate gave different accounts of what happened, with Starkweather saying Fugate was present and Fugate saying she'd come home after, but the outcome was still the same. On January 21st, 1958, both Marion and Velda Bartlett were shot to death, and their baby daughter, Betty Jean, was stabbed and strangled. Starkweather and Fugate spent a few days at the house watching TV and eating junk food while keeping other people at bay by saying the family was sick. Starkweather would later say it was the happiest time of his life. Of course, they couldn't keep up the facade for long and had to flee before the family members arrived and found the three bodies stashed in an outhouse. Police issued an alert for Starkweather and Fugate. The couple fled, but car troubles hampered their escape. When the car got stuck in mud, Starkweather and Fugate ventured to a farm owned by August Meyer. Starkweather shot Meyer in the head with a shotgun, and the couple ransacked the house where they took odds and ends, a pump rifle, and less than $100 before they went back to the car to dig it out. Stupidly, the car got stuck again in the mud, and they were forced to make their escape on foot until a Ford hot rod with two teens inside drove by and offered them a ride. The couple took Robert Jensen Jr. and his fiancée Carol King hostage, drove them back to Meyer's farm, and executed them in the basement. They took Jensen's hot rod and left, back to Lincoln. When the bodies were found, the spree killers made national news. Articles about the murders were printed side by side with articles about interstate construction. Starkweather and his young girlfriend next hit the home of an industrialist, C. Laurel Ward, and his wife Clara in a wealthy part of Lincoln. There, Starkweather stabbed the maid, Lillian Fensel, to death and then killed the Wards when they arrived home. Once again, they ransacked the house for money and jewelry and then made off in Clara's 1956 Packard. The governor called out the National Guard, and law enforcement from all different agencies started to comb Lincoln for the spree killers. But the couple were already heading west to Wyoming. On the highway outside of Douglas, Wyoming, the couple attempted to ditch the Packard because it was so recognizable. They came across traveling salesman Merle Colson sleeping in his Buick, and they killed him and tried to take his car. However, Starkweather didn't know how to release the parking brake, which was a relatively new invention at the time, and the car kept stalling. Another man, Joe Sprinkler, came across the couple, but fought back when Starkweather tried to pull a rifle on him. Just by happenstance, a sheriff's deputy drove by and stopped. Fugate ran towards the deputy and pretty much threw Starkweather under the bus, screaming that Starkweather had kidnapped her. Starkweather took off in the Packard, and deputies from various counties gave chase and shot at Starkweather. The teen killer gave up after he was cut by glass, and he thought he was bleeding to death. That's why he stopped. That's the kind of yellow son of a bitch he is, Converse County Sheriff Earl Heflin said. Both Starkweather and Fugate were arrested, and neither of them fought extradition back to Nebraska, mainly because Starkweather thought he would be put to death in either state, so it didn't really matter. Ironically, the Wyoming governor at the time abhorred the death penalty. Starkweather's loss. In Nebraska, Starkweather confessed to the murders, but claimed Fugate had participated in them as well, and went so far to say she had stabbed and strangled her own baby sister. Fugate claimed she didn't even know her family was dead until after her arrest, and that Starkweather had kidnapped her. It didn't matter. Starkweather was found guilty and executed in the electric chair in 1959, a year after he was convicted. He was buried in the same cemetery as some of his victims. Fugate was tried on first-degree murder and received a life sentence. She was paroled after 17 years and moved to Michigan. She still lives there today. HBO recently released a documentary series about her called The 12th Victim. Both Starkweather and Fugate have been the subject of multiple books, movies, songs, and even visual art projects. They are considered America's first highway killers. As I said that, it got me thinking. Highway crimes are actually nothing new. They are centuries old, but they took place on roads that you or I wouldn't think necessarily as highways. They were simply well-beaten dirt paths that took travelers directly from one town to the next. A lot of history about road criminals, or highwaymen, comes from England. The lore of highwaymen who traveled by horse had been heavily romanticized, but back in the late 17th century and into the 18th century, it probably wasn't so romantic to get held up by a mask-wearing, gun-wielding thief demanding your money and valuables. A highwayman would force carriages, stagecoaches, or wagons to stop, point a gun at their victims, and say, "Stand and deliver." It was normally enough for most people to cough up whatever they had. The most famous English highwayman was Dick Turpin. Dick turned to a life of crime in the 1730s. He joined a gang of thieves who ransacked houses, and then he became a highwayman around Lincoln. The one in England, not the one in Nebraska. During the commission of his crimes, Dick may have killed a man, but the story's a little bit dodgy at best. Under an alias, Dick was arrested for horse thievery in York, which, mind you, was a serious crime back then. It was like on par with murder. After authorities found out who Turpin really was, he was tried and convicted for multiple horse thefts in 1739. He was hanged by short drop a few days later, which that is a brutal, slow method of execution where you pretty much you're strangled to death. The next day he was buried, and his body was promptly dug up by body snatchers and probably sold to a medical school, which is not all that common in the 18th and 19th centuries. For more on body snatching, may I recommend Kate Winkler Dawson's podcast, Tenfold More Wicked. She has an excellent season called, The Body Snatcher, which is about a body snatching crime ring in Scotland in the 1800s. Highly recommend, very creepy. Highway robbery and murder began to decline in the late 1700s, due mostly in part to the formation of the Bow Street Horse Patrol, the government refusing to grant licenses to taverns and inns who granted sanctuary to highwaymen, and the fact that many people, they stopped carrying large amounts of money because of the formation of the banking system. In the American colonies, and then later in the US, highwaymen, also known as road agents, attacked travelers on desolate roads and later attacked stagecoaches, mail coaches, and settlers traveling out west. One of the most famous of these was Charles Earl Bowles, aka Black Bart, who robbed Wells Fargo stages along the Californian-Oregon border in the 1870s and 80s. 28 Wells Fargo stages to be exact. And oddly enough, he robbed these stages by foot rather than on horseback because he was afraid of horses. He was known as the gentleman outlaw because he never cursed, never fired his weapon, was a snazzy dresser, and was known to leave poems behind at his crime scenes. If getting robbed wasn't so frightening, getting robbed by Black Bart probably had been downright pleasant. The law finally caught up with him in 1883, and he was sentenced to only 6 years in prison. But don't worry, he was released after 4 years due to good behavior. But he never robbed stagecoaches again. These crimes began to wane in the late 1800s due to the increased security, such as Pinkertons, and the fact that banks and travelers began to utilize trains more than stagecoaches. Obviously, that led to train robberies, and train robberies led to interstate violence. Somehow, we always land back in California. If you didn't know anything about California, aside from you from what you learned on this podcast, or any other true crime podcast for that matter, you would think California was just a cesspool of crime and serial killers. It's not. Yeah, it has its fair share of psychopaths and some other pretty horrible things. But it is a beautiful state with beaches and mountains and deserts and wineries. OMG, the wineries. I could go on and on about the wineries, but we're here for crime. California got a jump on their highway system, and it dates all the way back to 1896 when the state took over management of the Lake Tahoe Wagon Road, which is now a part of US 50. A state highway system started construction in 1912, and many of California's highways merged with interstates in the 1950s and 60s. If you've ever been to California, you know there is no shortage of interstates, freeways, or highways. In fact, if you ask any Angelino for directions, they're going to throw a whole lot of numbers out at you. California is also one of those states where ground transportation is crucial. In the 1960s and 70s, if you didn't have a car, you took the bus or you hitchhiked. We've talked about hitchhiking before. It was just a way of life in the 1960s and 70s. Everyone knew it was a little bit risky, but for the most part, it was an easy way to get around California. Today, we all know the dangers of bumming a ride or picking up strangers. Unless it's Uber. Somehow, that makes it okay to get into a car with a complete stranger. But anyway, we know how dangerous hitchhiking is because of the nasty stuff that happened in the past. People got robbed, assaulted, raped, or killed on hitchhiking adventures. This was especially true in California. In her book, Ginger Strand introduced the dangers of California hitchhiking with the crimes of Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, which he certainly did take advantage of female hitchhikers on the highways, but we've talked about him on this podcast before. Instead, I want to talk about the fact that California had 3 serial killers who all earned the moniker the Freeway Killer. All 3 of them operated in the state roughly at the same time, and all 3 of them hunted the same kind of victim. Patrick Kearney, William Bonin, and Randy Kraft. All killers in the 1970s who picked up young men and boys off of California freeways. I got the following from murderpedia.org. Homosexual men were being murdered in scores from 1975 to 1977 and dumped unceremoniously along highways between Los Angeles and the Mexican border. All the identified victims had homosexual backgrounds. Each was found nude, shot in the head with a similar weapon. Several were dismembered or otherwise mutilated, and their remains were tied up in identical plastic garbage bags. The investigation centered on Patrick Wayne Kearney, an electronics engineer from Los Angeles who looked nothing like the, quote, stereotypical serial killer with his glasses and harmless demeanor. Wanted by police along with an acquaintance, David Hill, who was never charged with any crime related to the murders. Kearney's reign of death ended when he simply strolled into the Redondo Beach police station and gave himself up. Evidence recovered from Kearney's home included fibers matched to those on several corpses and a bloody hacksaw used in the dismemberment of certain victims. Kearney pled guilty to killing 3 men and was sentenced to life in prison. Authorities knew there were many more and offered Kearney a deal. The authorities wouldn't pursue the death sentence in exchange for a complete list of victims, which was pretty much the same deal Washington gave Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Kearney eventually confessed and pled guilty to 18 more killings, directing law enforcement to victims that were previously undiscovered. Kearney also admitted to another 11 murders that he was never prosecuted for, bringing his grand total to 32 killings. However, it's possible he's responsible for the deaths of 43 men, which would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in United States history. Kearney is still incarcerated in Mull Creek State Prison in California and is 83 years old. You may not have heard a lot about Kearney because his crimes were overshadowed by the next two killers. I got the following from California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, and it's pretty graphic. I wanted to impress upon you the brutality of Bonin's crimes. If you are triggered by scenes of violence, you may want to skip ahead. Listener discretion is advised. William George Bonin, the freeway killer, kidnapped, robbed, raped, and murdered a total of 14 teenage boys between 1979 and 1980. His span of killings lasted less than a year. His co-defendants were also young men between the ages of 17 and 21. Bonin was sentenced to death in 1982 for 10 murders throughout Los Angeles County. About a year later, he was convicted in Orange County for 4 other murders, for which he received a second death sentence. Bonin was also suspected of murdering other males, whose bodies were found around the same time period in Kern, Riverside, San Diego, and San Bernardino counties. Bonin was not prosecuted for those crimes. Originally, I was going to give you a chronological, case-by-case summary of the crimes in each of the 2 counties from which Bonin received a death sentence. During my first recording, I struggled to read each of them, and there are several. Many young men and boys as young as 12 were viciously slaughtered by Bonin and his accomplices. To give you a narrative, Bonin and his accomplices would pick up young boys, young men, in town on the side of highways. Bonin would rape these young men and boys in the back of his van, and he would either stab them, he would strangle them with their own t-shirts, he would bash their heads in with a tire iron, or he would make them drink caustic substances that burned their throats and their mouths. Bonin earned the name the Freeway Killer because many of these victims were dumped on the sides of interstates and freeways. And a lot of these crimes happened on the same day. Such as on February 3rd, 1980, Bonin and his accomplice Gregory Miley picked up Charles Miranda, 15, in West Hollywood. They drove a few blocks away, parked the car, and Bonin sodomized Charles. Miley robbed Charles of $6, and the 2 men tied his feet and hands together. Bonin wrapped Charles' shirt around his neck, and using a jack handle, Bonin twisted the shirt like a corkscrew until Charles was dead. They then drove to an alley in downtown Los Angeles and dumped Charles' nude body. Afterwards, they drove to Huntington Beach because they still wanted another victim. A little while later, they began talking to James McCabe, who was 12 years old and simply was on his way to Disneyland. They invited James into the van, where Bonin attacked him while Miley drove the van. Later, the 2 men held the victim down, beat him, strangled him with a shirt, and crushed his neck with a jack handle. They took the money out of James's wallet and then left his body next to a dumpster in the city of Walnut. He wasn't found until February 6th. Bonin's crimes continued like this until one of his accomplices, William Pugh, was arrested on auto theft charges on May 29th, and he simply decided to give Bonin up. He didn't confess to his role in the murders, which he certainly had a role in them. But he told detectives Bonin had picked him up from a party and bragged about killing young boys. The police placed Bonin under surveillance beginning on June 2nd. However, just hours before he went under surveillance, Bonin and his accomplice James Monroe were driving a van in Downey when they picked up a hitchhiker, Stephen J. Wells, 18. Initially, Stephen agreed to have sex with Bonin, and later he allowed himself to be tied up, expecting to be paid for having sex with a friend of Bonin's. Bonin and Monroe tied Stephen up, took his money, beat him, and then strangled him with his t-shirt. Monroe and Bonin then drove to Huntington Beach, where they left Stephen's nude body at the rear of a closed gas station, where it was found on June 3rd. It was only after the commission of this murder that police put him under surveillance. On June 11th, police followed Bonin's van into Hollywood. He was observed talking to 5 different young men standing on street corners before 15-year-old Harold T., who remained anonymous, entered his van. Bonin parked, with Harold still inside, in a vacant lot on Santa Monica Boulevard. Police witnessed the van violently rocking back and forth and approached the vehicle. Hearing the sounds of a struggle, the police broke into the van and caught Bonin raping Harold. After they arrested Bonin, they found a length of white nylon cord and 3 knives in the van. After his arrest, prosecution, and then a short stay in prison, Bonin was executed February 23, 1996, in the execution chamber at San Quentin State Prison. Bonin was the first California inmate to be executed by lethal injection. These were his last words. Quote, "That I feel the death penalty is not an answer to the problems at hand. I feel it sends the wrong message to youth of the country. Young people act as they see other people acting instead of as people tell them to act. And I would suggest that when a person has a thought of doing anything serious against the law, that before they did, that they should go to a quiet place and think about it seriously." Which I find to be very hypocritical words from a deranged sexual sadist. If you want to know more about Bonin and the investigation, I would recommend Jack Rosewood's book, William Bonin, The True Story of the Freeway Killer. It's not for the faint of heart, but Rosewood is very respectful towards the victims. Hulu's documentary, City of Angels, City of Death, also covers Bonin and the investigation leading up to his arrest. You should know, these murders made local and national news. Police implored people, especially boys and young men, not to hitchhike. Everyone was aware there was a serial killer hunting and dumping bodies near freeways and highways. What they couldn't imagine is there was a third freeway killer that had been hunting and killing a lot longer than Kearney and Bonin. I also got the following information from Murderpedia. On the outside, Randy Kraft seemed to be a normal guy, a successful computer programmer operating in sunny Southern California. On the inside, Kraft was a sexual sadist that may have committed as many as 67 murders. His killings are believed to have begun in the early 1970s and stretched until his arrest in 1983. His victims were all male, mostly gay, who Kraft would torture and mutilate, sometimes while his victims were still alive. Some of his victims were hitchhikers. Some were Marines he picked up outside their base. And some were just hanging out in places where Kraft just happened to be. I highly recommend reading Dennis McDougall's book, Angel of Darkness, The True Story of Randy Kraft and the Most Heinous Murder Spree. He did excellent research and paid great respect to all the victims. During the commission of these murders, both Kearney and Bonin were accused of Kraft's crimes, and Kraft would later be accused of crimes Kearney and Bonin are thought to have committed. Because these three operated at the same time, it has made it difficult for investigators to attribute unsolved murders to the correct freeway killer. What's even more chilling is how Kraft was caught and what police found after they searched his car. On a summer morning in 1983, Orange County officers pulled over a driver for drunk driving. The driver, Randy Kraft, got out of his car and began walking to the cruiser in a polite manner, which, if you've ever been in law enforcement, this is suspicious behavior. The officers walked Kraft back to his car and found the body of Terry Gambrell slumped over dead in the passenger seat. He had been strangled with a belt. A background check on Kraft revealed a 1966 arrest for lewd conduct in Huntington Beach. In 1975, he was arrested again for lewd conduct with another man, this time spending 5 days in jail and paying a small fine. Yes, homosexual activities were illegal in California at the time. Officers searched Kraft's car and found 47 photos of young men, some nude, some unconscious, some dead. They also found a briefcase. A briefcase contained a notebook with more than 60 messages in a code. It would become known as a scorecard. Searching Kraft's home, they found photos of 3 men whose deaths were still unsolved in Southern California. Robert Loggins had been found dead in September 1980. Roger Duvall and Jeffrey Nelson were last seen in February 1983, and their bodies were discovered days apart. Fibers from a rug in Kraft's garage matched fibers found on the body of Scott Hughes, who was found alongside the Riverside Freeway in April 1978. Items belonging to a man found dead near Grand Rapids, Michigan, were found in his home. Kraft had worked for a Santa Monica-based aerospace firm between June 1980 and January 1983, and had traveled to offices in Oregon and Michigan during times of some unsolved murders in each state. Prosecutors eventually cracked some of the codes in Kraft's notebook. 2-in-1 hitch referred to the murders of Nelson and Duvall. Maureen Carson referred to Richard Keith, a Marine last seen in Carson, California, and whose body was discovered in Laguna Hills in 1978. Jail Out referred to a murder he committed hours after being released from jail on June 11, 1978. Parking Lot referred to the murder of Keith Crotwell, an 8-year-old boy whose severed head was found by a group of fishermen. His body turned up a while later. Kraft was questioned in the case and admitted meeting Crotwell in a parking lot the day he vanished. Not only did Kraft earn the moniker the Freeway Killer, but also the name the Scorecard Killer. In September 1983, the charges against Kraft stood at 16 murders, 11 counts of sodomy, 9 counts of sexual mutilation, and 3 counts of robbery. In January the next year, prosecutors pinned him with 21 additional murders, spanning 12 years and 3 states. Kraft was found guilty and given the death sentence. He is currently awaiting execution on death row in San Quentin State Prison at the age of 78. There are still several photos of men in Kraft's collection and entries in his scorecard that Los Angeles and Orange County investigators still haven't identified. Needless to say, Kraft isn't talking. If the trio of freeway killers wasn't enough to scare you, there's a classification of interstate killers who work in plain sight. Truck driving serial killers. These men, and yes, I use the pronoun men because most serial killers are men, have a reason to be on the road and are more difficult to catch because they abduct their victims in one area of the country and can dispose of their bodies in another. According to the FBI, quote, if there is such a thing as an ideal profession for a serial killer, it may well be as a long-haul truck driver, end quote. Todd Burke, a professor of criminal justice at Radford University in Virginia and a former Maryland police officer, suggested truck driving is an ideal profession for serial killers because of the anonymity, mobility, and lack of supervision. He said the following: "They have a means of transportation. They have the space. You can bring victims into the truck. You can have activities with them in the truck, sexual or otherwise, and you can go to another location and do a drop-off." The FBI publicly noted that most victims of truck driving serial killers are women who are living high-risk transient lifestyles, often involving substance abuse and prostitution. They're frequently picked up at truck stops or service stations and sexually assaulted, murdered, and dumped along the highway. These are victims we have discussed in previous episodes about Gary Ridgway and Lonnie David Franklin Jr. High-risk victims that both society and some police tend to turn their noses up at. Their transient lifestyle also means it takes longer for people to notice they've gone missing. Unfortunately, they are the perfect opportune victims for sexual predators. I was going to present the case of trucker Keith Jesperson, the happy face killer, who, between 1990 and 1995, raped and murdered several sex workers while driving the interstates and highways of the United States. But in my research, I stumbled upon violent offenders who made Jesperson seem kind of tame. Once again, you may want to skip a few minutes ahead. Listener discretion is advised. Joe Metheny was an obese, 6-foot-tall serial killer with an appetite for human flesh. In the mid-1990s, he killed 2 sex workers, dismembered their bodies, and stored their body parts in his freezer. Following his eventual arrest, he claimed he used human flesh mixed in with hamburger meat and sold it to customers at his hamburger stand in Baltimore. Working as a truck driver in 1994, Metheny developed a desire to kill and consume people. It was during this time that his wife left him, taking along their son, and set off the rage-filled monster within him. He was tried in Baltimore and sentenced to death in 1998, but it was overturned and he was resentenced to life without parole. He died in prison in 2017. In November 1998, long-haul trucker Wayne Adam Ford calmly walked into Humboldt County Sheriff's Office in Eureka, California, and presented the officers with a woman's severed breast. He shocked authorities even further when he confessed to murdering 4 women between 1997 and 1998. There possibly could be more. Ford often picked up young white hitchhikers during his truck routes. He would rape and kill them in his truck, then keep their bodies for several days before disposing of them. He confessed to his crimes because God told him to. He was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder on June 27, 2006, and sentenced to death. He remains on death row at San Quentin. Timothy J. Vigades was a Minnesota truck driver who kidnapped young women and kept them in a torture room inside his truck, which he called the Twilight Express. He wore fangs. He forced his victims to wear fangs before he filed their teeth down into actual fangs. He was arrested during a routine truck stop inspection when inspectors saw bruises on his young female passenger and learned that she had a protection order out against him. As it turned out, he kidnapped the 19-year-old girl and kept her in his truck for 6 months. He was sentenced in Utah to 20 years for kidnapping, rape, and other charges. Robert Ben Rhodes prowled the roads of Texas and Illinois, picking up hitchhikers and murdering them in his long-haul truck between 1975 and 1990. The killer turned the cab of his truck into a torture chamber where he inflicted pain on his unsuspecting victims before killing them. Rhodes' most infamous case was the kidnapping and murder of a 14-year-old Regina K. Walters. The driver picked her up with her boyfriend in Texas, held her in captivity for several days after killing her boyfriend. Before ending her life, Rhodes took an eerie photo of the frightened Regina in a barn where her body was later found. Rhodes was arrested in 1990 and was convicted for 3 murders and was sentenced to life without parole in Illinois. Police suspect that he may be responsible for as many as 50 murders. The list goes on and on and on, and we don't have the time, the inclination, or the stomach for the rest. While these types of killers have been on the roads for decades, the FBI only really started pulling it all together in 2004. In that year, Terry Turner, an analyst from the Oklahoma Bureau of Investigation, detected a crime pattern. The bodies of murdered women were being dumped along Interstate 40 in Oklahoma, Texas, Arkansas, and Mississippi. Turner and other local law enforcement agencies eventually identified a suspect, a trucker named John Robert Williams. After his arrest for murder in a separate case, Williams confessed to killing a total of 12 women, including those Turner was investigating. Since his arrest, he has since claimed to have killed over 30 women. Turner and a police colleague from the Grapevine, Texas Police Department referred the case to the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or VICAP, where analysts looked at other records in its database to see if there were similar patterns of highway killings elsewhere. Turns out there were. Shortly after Turner's discovery, the FBI launched the Highway Serial Killings Initiative to raise awareness among law enforcement agencies and the general public about murders committed by serial killers on interstates and highways. Since the program began, FBI analysts have produced a roster of more than 750 murder victims found along or near U.S. highways. They have also identified 450 potential suspects, many of them truck drivers. After researching all that, I reached out to a friend's husband who is a truck driver and works his ass off hauling much needed food across the country. First, he wanted to tell you all that most truck drivers are the friendliest, hardest working, salt of the earth type people you will ever meet. And if it wasn't for long haul truckers, well, your grocery bill would be a hell of a lot more expensive. Second, he told me that most drivers keep their eyes open for asshats who hurt other people. These offenders are not welcome among other drivers, and he had a few more choice words to say about what would happen to an offender if they were caught by another trucker. It wasn't pretty, and it was awfully graphic. His advice was simple. Respect truckers, give them distance and patience on the road, and simply stay out of their cabs for your safety and theirs. Mike, thank you for your advice, and stay safe out there, buddy. Finally, these monsters are being caught, and those unsolved highway murders are finally being solved with the help of diligent cold case investigators and genetic genealogy. Last year, Harry Edward Greenwell was identified as the man known as the I-65, or Days Inn Killer, an elusive figure who raped and killed 3 female motel clerks along Interstate 65 in Indiana and Kentucky starting in 1987. Decades after the murders took place, Indiana State Police and the FBI were able to use genetic genealogy to generate investigative leads on the killer. Greenwell, who was born in 1944 and unfortunately died in 2013, had an extensive criminal history and had been in and out of prison several times. Investigators were able to put together a timeline of Greenwell's movements through police reports and newspaper archives. Greenwell is feared to be responsible for additional murders, rapes, robberies, and assaults stretching from Gary, Indiana, down to Mobile, Alabama, the entire length of Interstate 65. Though he did escape justice for these murders, I hope the knowledge of his identity at least answers some questions for the families, and I hope the use of genetic genealogy can solve more interstate murders. Until then, travel safely. Don't hitchhike or pick up hitchhikers. Get your car checked out before long road trips. Let someone know which routes you'll be taking and check in with them during rest stops. Invest in a road assistance membership. Give semi-trucks respect and distance. Stop at well-lit and well-patronized rest stops, gas stations, restaurants, and hotels. And for the love of sweet baby Jesus, don't hog the left-hand lane. And that wraps up the first season. But don't worry, there will be a few bonus episodes until I'm back for the second season. And I've already recorded a bonus episode with a dear friend, and we'll be talking about something that concerns all single women. And men too. I also might just have time to record an episode on Crime Cruise, which is just a few weeks away. Eternal squeal of delight. I'll be sure to let you guys know how the cruise went. I pretty much have the second season, the schedule at least, locked down. And let's all cross your fingers I can actually stay on schedule. A few things to remember before we end. If you have any information about the cases I've highlighted in previous episodes, please contact the appropriate law enforcement agencies I mentioned during those episodes. If you feel uncomfortable for any reason reaching out to law enforcement, you can always contact me at thehistorybehindthecrime@gmail.com or Instagram at thehistorybehindthecrime. Remember, someone out there knows something. You may not, but you may know people who do. Share these cases with them. Also, you can all reach out to me for anything else. Comments, questions, suggestions, stories, whatever. I love hearing from you. You guys make checking my email so exciting. So to be honest, yeah, I'm going to miss you guys. And I want you to do me a big favor. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. Bye.